Good morning. It's Monday morning. We're on Luke chapter 9 verses 10 through 17. On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done. And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came to him and said to him, "Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place." But Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." And they did so and had them all sit down. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied, and what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So, a couple things here. When they come back, suddenly they're known as the apostles. Remember, we said that apostello means I send you. And so they're now just referred to as the apostles. So Luke is, writing this many years later and remembering, and that was the common title for those people at that point. But so that's what he calls them. So they go to Bethsaida, and he's teaching and curing people of their diseases, and it gets late, and he says, "Feed the crowd. You can do it." And the guys are like, "We've got 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's a box lunch. How are we going to feed all these people with one little lunch?" He says, "Oh, sit them down," and he prays, and they start passing it out, and there's just enough. And there's more than enough. There's 12 baskets of bread left over. How did this happen? Well, some say, well, when somebody started sharing, everybody else kind of pulled their lunch out of their cloak and shared it, and all of a sudden there was plenty of food. Which reminds me of a story from Tony Campolo. Said one time he was speaking at some sort of event, a women's event in Philadelphia somewhere. A lot of women there, and they heard a presentation about the need for some medical piece of equipment in some country somewhere. And the woman in charge said, "Oh, Dr. Campolo, will you pray? Will you pray that God will provide this money?" And you know what he was supposed to do? He was supposed to get up and say a nice prayer, and they could all nod, and that would be that. Campolo reaches into his pocket and pulls out his wallet and says, "I will not," and puts the $6 in his wallet down on the communion table and looks at the woman and says, "Your turn." And she opens her purse and she's got, $20. She puts her money on the table, and then he goes down the row. And by the time he'd gone through the whole crowd, they had enough to buy 3 or 4 of these machines. And he said, the audacity to pray to God to provide what he's already given us. So you can ponder that. That's not really the lesson today, but some people read this story that way, that when Jesus began to pass the bread and the fish, what little there were, other people began to also share. So that's a possibility. I don't really buy it. It's more like a pre-Eucharistic miracle. He points to the bread and the wine that will feed us. And he says, it's miraculously feeding all these people. I don't have any problem with that. Jesus provides for us, even when we think it's hopeless. We've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. How are we going to feed, 75 people? How are we going to feed 5,000 men and their families? How are we going to feed all these people? Take a deep breath. It'll be enough. God will provide. Ponder that today. Tomorrow we'll get back into this, and we'll see you then.